All right. I want to welcome everyone to the Greenlight Guru True Quality Roadshow. This is a 3-day event designed to provide actionable takeaways you can implement in your own company to innovate faster, stay ahead of regulatory changes, and use quality as your strategic asset to grow your device business. This session is about how user experience design and human factors engineering can accelerate product development. My name is John Spear. I'm the founder and VP of Quality and Regulatory here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be the moderator for this event. We've got a really special presentation scheduled for you today, and I know our presenters, Milton Yarberry and Miles Buroker, are really looking forward to sharing their valuable insights and expertise on human factors, guidance, regulations, and engineering process overview, along with the difference between regulatory usability and UX. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our presenters, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, this session is going to run for about 45 minutes in total, and we'll include a Q&A session at the end where Milton and Miles have been kind enough to answer your questions. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation as they come up in the box on the right-hand side, and we will get to as many of them as time permits. Yes, this entire session, as with all of the True Quality Virtual Summit sessions, are being recorded, and there will be a replay available after the session. Once this session wraps up, there is a 10-minute break before the next live session begins. And if you're interested in learning about that session, it's about best practices for preparing and conducting pre-submission meetings. So I encourage you to make sure you're registered for that session and use your unique link to tune in. If you are not already signed up, you can register for that next session and over 20 others at the virtual-summit.greenlight.guru page. So be sure to check that out. Now, let me say a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on this free virtual summit. If you've ever been on one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. Likely a similar mission as many of you on today's summit. Anything that we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker and with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free events and training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device consultants, or through our award-winning medical device QMS software. If you'd like to learn more about why and how medical device companies from across the globe are moving away from paper-based general-purpose quality management systems and adopting the purpose-built medical device quality management software from Greenlight Guru, then I would encourage you to head over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation to schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. In doing so, you'll learn how the very best medical device companies are leveraging our purpose-built quality management software to gain ISO 13485 2016 certification, market approval, breeze through audits and inspections, and push beyond just compliance to produce true quality medical devices. So again, if you're interested in learning how we can help your medical device company, make sure you go visit www.greenlight.guru after today's webinar and schedule your personalized demo. Now let's get on to the bulk of this particular presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to our speakers today. Milton Yarberry is the Director of Medical Programs at Integrated Computer Solutions Incorporated. ICS blends art, engineering, and technology to build custom, real-time embedded medical systems, leveraging expertise in user experience, design, and full-stack software development. He is a certified project management professional with a background in software architecture, medical device product development, and program management. Milton spent a decade in consulting, working with startup companies, and 15 years with Class 2 and Class 3 medical device manufacturers. He is joined today by Miles Buroker. Miles is a human factors engineer at UserWise. UserWise works with medical device companies to fulfill steps of the usability engineering process and maintain compliance to applicable standards and regulations. Miles first joined UserWise as a full-time consultant in 2019. He is experienced in forming use-related risk analyses and test protocols, observing usability study sessions for formative and validation testing, preparing test reports, risk-benefit analyses, and human factors engineering submission reports for FDA, providing human factors trainings and workshops, and with establishing compliance documentation for IEC 62366 and FDA guidance documents. So without further ado, let me hand it over to today's speakers, Milton Yarberry and Miles Buroker. Gentlemen, take it away.
Hey guys, and for the record, I know it says Milton on both of them. I'm Miles over here. Milton's over there. And I'm going to start by quickly touching on who UserWise is. And UserWise works with medical product companies to fulfill all steps of the usability engineering process. And these medical device companies include, or medical product companies include those of medical devices and combination products. And throughout this process, to maintain compliance to applicable standards and regulations, both in the US and outside of the US. And we're going to go through the usability engineering process today more in depth. And our company mission is to inspire usability engineering best practices within medical product companies and to facilitate the development of usable medical products. And essentially, as you'll see today, usability, human factors engineering, as it pertains to medical devices, is focused on proving and actuating safe and effective use of the product.
Hey, Milton, you might be on mute.
Yes, I am. Too many mutes
All right.
to deal with. Thank you for the heads up. Yeah, so about ICS. So we're about 120 employees, founded in 1987. We're headquartered out of Boston. Basically, we're a full stack architecture and development firm. We serve the medical and automotive industries and other commercial industries. We have a UX arm called Boston UX, which is offers sort of full-scale UX software development with a 62366 compliant process. Also, one other thing I should say is I understand there is a PDF available in the presentation with details for a 4-hour free architectural assessment by ICS that we're running right now. So if you are in one of our product spaces, we'd love to hear from you.
All right, so I'm going to start off by talking about human factors engineering and why it's important. And the FDA defines human factors as the application of knowledge about human behavior, abilities, limitations, to the design of medical devices, including mechanical and software-driven interfaces, user documentation, and user training to enhance and demonstrate safe and effective use. And that last sentence there, safe and effective use, or demonstrate safe and effective use, that is the bottom line for the human factors engineering process. And this diagram here on the right is taken directly from the FDA's resources. It's handy in visualizing how human factors can allow you to, promote correct use in normal use of your product. In taking into account the use environment, the user groups, and the device user interface itself, and seeing how all those interact with actual use of the device, you can promote correct use as an outcome once your product is hit market. And why is human factors engineering important? Conservatively estimated, there are over 200,000 preventable hospital deaths per year in the United States, which is 5 times as much as there are automobile accidents and 100 times as much as there are, or 1,000 times as much in aviation. And about 10% of these preventable hospital deaths are attributed to design and use issues. And implementing human factors engineering early and often can help prevent and mitigate these adverse events that do result in injury and death. If to put it in perspective, we lose about the same number of people every year as we lost in the entire American Civil War. So this is just a pretty stark reminder about the importance of safety of use and design in medical products. So I mentioned implementing human factors early and often in the development process. And while this graph is conceptual and qualitative, it is based on evidence from the over 100 medical products that we have helped through the human factors engineering process. So let's look first at the development with human factors implemented early and often. By early on identifying user needs and requirements and making design standards and requirements, thereby it's going to cost more upfront, but there are going to be fewer hurdles, and you're going to go through an iterative design process that will reveal design issues, use issues, and allow you to make mistakes early and often. So you pass validation at first attempt, and there's little support cost post-market. If we look at this pink graph here, the cost without human factors, we've seen this happen where human factors is implemented very late in the design process, and as I'm sure you all know, last-minute design changes because of realization of mismatch of needs and expectations with the actual design of the product lead to high costs, and unexpected validation results may require revalidation in order to get clearance or approval. And later on, expensive training and support is required due to these ease of use issues, and it'll be expensive in terms of support costs going on because of customer service and possibly even recall. So now we're just going to take a look at a couple of examples of how human factors engineering being implemented could have prevented certain medical device or medical product recalls. And now I'm just going to let you guys think for a few seconds. What do you think is the error that people would make with this? And there's two here. The first that's fairly clear is that the decimal point nearly blends into the tail of that 2 there. And by assuming that it's 22 millimoles per liter, that as opposed to 2.2, you might severely affect your healthcare treatment plan as a diabetic, and that could ultimately lead to severe consequences. And another thing that is kind of overlooked, but was also part of the recall, was this millimole per liter or millimolar, which is generally used outside the US. In the US, we generally use milligrams per deciliter. And this device or this product was intended to have the option of toggling between the 2 units for that international businessman who might need to use millimolar while he or she is abroad. And realistically, by not realizing that that is a very small sliver of the actual user population, there were a lot of mistakes made because the units that are ultimately, or the number that is output is ultimately going to be very different for those different units. Go to the next one here. And then this one, an EEG was recalled because the software led users to confuse the left and right hemispheres of the brain. As you can see, this one here on the left that's labeled left is actually the right hemisphere, and vice versa. And obviously, this can lead to severely incorrect patient outcomes and treatment plans. So naturally, this is something that could have been captured fairly early on by people noticing in the design process that this actually is a mismatch in terms of labeling and displaying. So I'm going to discuss a bit about the human factors guidance and regulations. So the first actual regulation that sort of birthed the human factors team at the FDA was quality system regulation. And while not explicitly stating human factors, under G, design validation here, this sort of discusses what human factors validation is, ensuring that devices conform to defined user needs and intended uses, and shall include testing of production units under actual or simulated use conditions. And not verbatim, but the same exact sentiment is mirrored in the 2016 FDA guidance, which I'll talk about in a few moments, a few slides. But ultimately, this law has been used as the regulatory basis, legal basis for the development of the human factors program through the FDA. And this graph here is from the FDA, from a webinar that they gave at the CDRH, and it sort of mirrors their thinking about, or their interpretation of uptake and implementation of human factors processes, both at the FDA and in industry, which started with the quality systems regulations in 1996, up through 2007 with the formation of the CDRH human factors team. And this graph ends at 2016 when the FDA released their guidance in applying human factors and usability engineering to medical devices. But since then, all Class 2 and Class 3 devices must submit human factors data with their submission to the FDA for market clearance or approval. And so these are the guidances related to human factors, essentially serve as the Bible for UserWise. And the front two here are the most important. Like I said, applying human factors and usability engineering to medical devices there on the front left, and list of high priority devices for human factors review. And I highly recommend reviewing the high priority devices review if you're early in or at any stage in the development process, just to verify what you need to do and what you need to submit to the FDA with your submission. In the back, on the back left and right, those are related to guidances related to clinical studies and comparative analyses for combination products, and their guidance issued by CDER. In the back middle is guidance related to design considerations for interoperable medical devices. And more pertinent to the world that we've lived in for the past handful of months, we also are fairly knowledgeable about EUAs and preparation for EUAs, and also human factors considerations related to that, into submitting EUAs. And this front guidance here was actually initially released in 2017, just about how the emergency use authorization is issued and how companies can submit for emergency use authorization. And there are several enforcement policies out now for the COVID-19 pandemic related to PPE, ventilators, and IVD tests. And if you have any questions about how UserWise can help you with that, feel free to reach out to me. My email's at the end of the slide deck, but that's not the focus of the presentation today. And we also help with compliance to EU and outside the US otherwise. And we generally follow 62366-1 outside the US, which is the primary out of the US standard for human factors. Also follow the risk management process standard in 14971, 60601-1-6, which is safety and essential performance basic safety and essential performance requirements for medical electrical equipment. And we also follow these design recommendation standards such as HE75, 60601-1-8, and also use symbols that are ISO IEC standardized. So now we're going to go through the human factors process, and we generally view it as a 5-step process, starting with user research and risk analysis, which involves iterative prototyping, usability testing, and risk analysis, up to usability validation in terms of validating safe and effective use of the device, and ultimately human factors submission to the FDA or a notified body. And user research generally is reviewing the capabilities, characteristics, education, background, certain limitations such as dexterity for patients as well, and seeing how those characteristics actually impact the design, and also thinking about whether, say, a device might be used in the OR by both physicians and surgical techs. Will the difference in their trainings and educational backgrounds affect the design, or how does it affect the design? On top of this, we also look at what environmental conditions that the device will be used in. Importantly, lighting levels, sound levels. If it's an emergency ventilator, for example, that's going to be used on the side of a freeway, you need to account for the potential for a lot of ambient noise. And so through user research and through also identifying known use problems through review of complaint data, medical device reports, and recall data from FDA databases and now UDAMED, as well as reviewing information from first-generation legacy products from customer service and sales reps, if that's applicable, and also user interviews and research or literature research and review. This all informs the use-related risk analysis by allowing you to see what the issues are with similar predicate devices or with earlier legacy devices or from the users for some first-in-class medical product. And the use-related risk analysis is similar to a process or a design risk analysis, but is focused on user inputs and primarily by looking at the use environment, the user profiles, and by using analytical and empirical methods to identify use errors iteratively through the design process, you can develop the risk analysis or the use-related risk analysis. And use error, I'm going to talk about the differences in definitions both in the US and outside the US. And you're going to adapt your protocol to which notified body that you are submitting to, depending on or according to these definitions. And I think something that I first want to touch on is that the term user error is archaic. It puts the blame and the onus on the user, not on the design of the device, where we see 99% of use errors and issues as attributable to design. And if you look at these definitions, the primary difference here is in the FDA definition that it references that use error is user action or lack of action that caused a result that did or could result in harm. Most of the definition is fairly similar, but the FDA is a bit more narrow in the fact that it implies that harm is possible or is actually actuated. Important distinction to note there. And in usability testing, we work in all different sorts of realms. We do early stage formative studies on mock-ups, prototypes, wireframes, just to essentially, understand user needs and design requirements therein. We also complete later stage end-to-end formative studies to confirm readiness for validation and really work out those kinks, and also final summative usability, human factors validation testing for regulatory submissions. And the FDA outlines some very specific stuff about human factors validation testing, particularly that for each user profile, there will be 15 participants. So if there are physicians and surgical techs using your product, then you have to have 30, for example, 30 participants in the study, 15 of each user profile. They must be US residents. They must have representative training or lack thereof, which also includes presentation of materials like instructional and training materials like the IFU, and have appropriate training decay from an hour to 1 day. Participants must have no prior exposure to that product, and the participants must use the device independently and naturally without interference or influence from the facilitator, moderator, or observer of the study. So it has to be completely neutral and allow them to make mistakes, because you want to see that this actually is safe and effective for use, this product. That's what we're validating. It's almost the opposite of a clinical study in that sense. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously it is a very close quarters, or in normal times it was a close quarters sort of thing that we did, usability testing. So we have been taking precautions by requiring PPE and disinfecting, as well as contact tracing with the participants and having them notify us and get tested if they show symptoms prior to or 2 weeks after the study session. At our study facility, we are able to do remote moderation and observation. We have remote cameras, and also naturally local regulations supersede study protocol. And a common question we get is, what can I do so that we pass human factors validation testing? And from our experience from helping over 100 medical device product manufacturers navigate this process, we have seen the most success from companies that implement human factors and UX best practices early in the development stage and perform iterative testing early on and often. And both human factors and UX are tools that seem like more work up front, but they greatly reward and accelerate your time to market if done early and often. And with that, I'm going to let Milton talk about UX.
Oh, thank you, Miles. I figured out the mute on my own this time. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about human factors engineering and basically how to accelerate your product development with it, or how it ends up accelerating your product development. Human factors is actually a pretty big pool. So within that, I'm looking at specifically UX or usability, and a further focus in there on software. But first, a vignette. This is a concept that I found sort of interesting once I started learning about this area. So this is a little bit of a Venn diagram with human factors sort of occupying the biggest, broadest term here. Often people are confused by the either overlap or distinction between the terms usability and user experience. As Miles mentioned, usability is really about safe and effective use. I think of this as, in the risk mitigation bucket. Then there's the user experience, which is a very different thing. It more has to do with, do you like using the device? Is it a pleasant usage experience? Is it learnable, efficient, delightful, etc.? I found it kind of interesting that these two concepts where you think that, well, naturally, if a device is easy to use, then that must mean it's safe and effective. But actually, these two concepts can push against each other. And this is something to sort of be aware of when you're developing medical devices, that the easiest thing isn't always the safest thing. And the safest thing isn't always pleasant. And the chief example that always grates on me a little bit is the "Are you sure?" dialogue used with a little bit too much enthusiasm. So a little bit of a plug here for 62366. So overall, the process of UX development, particularly as we sort of try to practice it at ICX, is really a very reasonable thing that you would normally do for your product anyway. 62366 basically just puts you through a process of documenting this. But in my mind, if I had a product that could cause harm in a medical environment, then I would first want to make sure I understood all the concerns from users and the environment that they're using it in. I would want to identify all hazards and consequences with it. I want to make sure I know how it can hurt people. I would implement controls, and then I would test it. And the flow chart on the right there is sort of a simplification of a longer, a bit more difficult to read one that's in 62366. But it basically contains this reasoning, or this flow. Find out who is using it, figure out how it's dangerous, implement controls, and test them. I mean, what more can you say in terms of how you would naturally try to protect your product anyway? At ICS and Boston UX, the way we use UX to sort of feed the regulatory development is sort of partitioned into two halves here. On the left-hand side is the stuff that we do under 62366, but it's basically before you begin sort of like the heavy design controls that must accompany, production code software development. So on the left-hand side, this is sort of a reformulation of the steps in the previous slide, but you basically define and analyze your users and product environment. And then you would go into a rapid software prototyping sort of scenario where you would create, you would pick out the touchy areas that you need to propose solutions for, come up with a quick prototype, and then evaluate that in a formative study. So this is ICS's preferred method, is to start with the 62366 and then sort of switch into design controls once you start doing the software back end. The step that it rolls into after that is if you have software that basically can take whatever you were using for your formative studies. So here I'm thinking about prototypes, software prototypes that you do a formative study on. You validate a particular area to make sure that users aren't confused by the usage of the device and the harm that they could potentially cause. And any of that you have developed, depending upon your tool set, there could be a pretty straightforward sort of conversion to an application of your prototypes. And there's various software out there to do this. ICS has some proprietary software. Other companies do too. And then finally, you go through your normal software development process. Here I refer to it as developing the back end. To look at this in a little more detail. What I want to say is, so what's different here is that you really get sort of a more mature front end. And you get that by front end, I mean the user interface, and you see fewer changes subsequently under design controls. So here's just a little more detail, and what I'm just going to point out really quickly here, because I think I'm running a little long on time here. There are specific deliverables in here that directly go from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. The first of these is a UX specification. UX specification is the things you might get from your analysis, such as text, font size, readability, visibility. Those sort of things need to be part of your software specifications so that you develop to that, so that you have the right font size, the right resolution, that sort of thing. You also get GUI navigation and GUI definition documents, and those become sort of, gold for your test team as they need something as a gold standard to test the software to. And then lastly, all the documentation you do for 62366, as Miles said, goes into your FDA submission under the HFE UE report. Another little quick vignette. Some of you know the acronym SOUP, Software of Unknown Provenance. I thought it was kind of funny that there's now in use a term UP, although I've never heard it pronounced before, which is user interfaces of unknown provenance. The common thread between the two is that SOUP is developed without a known, or developed but not under a known process. Similarly for the user interfaces. There's three things you can do with a user interface that was developed, so sort of a legacy user interface. You can perform a full usability process on it, which is basically following 62366, parts 5.1 to 5.9. Or you can rely on a post-market analysis report where you take a look at how it's performing in the field and make a case that it doesn't need the pushing through the process. And the last is that you would simply invent a rationale that the legacy UI doesn't need this. And I don't know anybody who's done that, but I'm sure they're out there. So I just wanted to revisit this. I'm sorry if I'm in a bit of a rush. So the key takeaways here are that the high fidelity prototypes in terms of design or streamlining your development, this is the thing that gives the biggest bang for the buck. You really get fewer late stage changes with the more work you do up front, and you do the work up front without the burden of design controls. So it's really sort of a win-win there. Then also you get UX specifications, which goes over to your software engineers. You have a user interface definition, which becomes the gold standard for your test engineers. And then you have define and prototype, basically documentation you generated, which then goes straight into your 510K. Of all these three, it's really the biggest is the first one, where it's almost difficult to overstate the benefit of having a mature product that everybody's bought off in, and that then you're just simply filling out the back end under design controls. All right, I think that brings us to the end. And I don't know if we have time for Q&A or if we're at the end of our...
We do.
Console. Okay.
No, we have time for a few questions. And again, thank you, Miles and Milton. Let me click on all the right buttons here. So let's dive into some of the questions. So Andrea question is the chart on slides 12 and 13 implies considering human factors since the beginning of the time scale. What does implementing human factors look like during the research phase of a project?
So in terms of the research phase of a project, I think at that point, and I think we try to really hammer this, especially in our webinars, that doing user research early on, so that way you have an idea when you go into that development phase of the design requirements because of or from the users. I think that sort of research is critical. It's a very useful time to get that done because it's appropriate at that point in time. So I think, reiterating what I said, early and often human factors is important. And realistically, by identifying those sorts of user needs early on, you will avoid problems later in the development process.
All right, Milton, anything to add to that one?
No, I think that covers it very well. I mean, it's normally we come in just after sort of the research where you have that defined and you know the product that you're going after. So
okay, terrific. Next question comes from Jan. Jan asks, can you give an example on a human factors that ends as a design input?
Would you be able to elaborate on that a bit more, Jan?
Yeah, Jan, add a few more words to that one.
I might be able to speak to it.
All right, we'll go ahead and give it a try, and we'll see if Jan adds some more in the meantime. Go ahead, Milton.
Yeah, so just in terms, I think I sort of touched on font size, viewability, brightness. Those are the things that can come out of your research in terms of who your users are, what conditions they're using it in, how far away are they from the device, and what that means to engineering, software engineering.
Okay, Jan, if you have more specifics, please chime in. Next question comes from Diraj. Diraj asks, what are the various input sources and types for usability engineering, specifically complying to new risk management standard requirement, such as reasonably foreseeable misuse?
So I think I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I did have a conversation with a colleague about this recently about the new risk management standard. And I think what you're trying to get at is that ultimately we're still not, considering abnormal use as in terms of, device outside of the fully outside of the intended use. I don't think that's what we're looking at here with reasonably foreseeable misuse. I think though, ultimately just certain, I guess, fiddling or pressing wrong buttons and stuff like that, just to be more broad, I think this term or this phrase, I guess, has popped up in the new risk management standard, just so that way it's more clear what is expected to be analyzed, not just explicit, abnormal use or use error that actually leads to harm, but just misuse in general that's reasonably foreseeable based on the limitations of the design and of the product.
Yeah, and I guess I have to believe that that's part of why you do some of the human factors study to sort of uncover the reasonably foreseeable misuse too, right?
Exactly, because I think it's, especially when it's your baby, it's really hard to think that, it could be misused, but there are, certain things like, let's say, a console is designed with one button on the front, but that is for some other thing that's not the power, but everyone thinks it's the power button. That I think, falls under reasonably foreseeable misuse, and people don't uncover that without conducting those early formative tests, because I think that's a pretty critical, use error misuse right there.
Yeah, and I wonder if any of this, and I'm curious about your opinions, has to do with preventing manufacturers from encroaching on intended use that isn't stated. So if you have a product which has something that gives you some diagnostic information, but is not a diagnostic tool, but it's sort of providing diagnostic information, if that counts as foreseeable.
Yeah, I believe that also would fall under this category, because I mean, it also can Something we didn't touch upon is, perception, cognition, action, task analysis, and those are all different. Perception, cognition, and action are all different ways that use error can be actuated. And the button issue is more of an action thing, also with cognition, but perception is more what you're talking about, where with using that sort of diagnostic information in the wrong way. So,
right.
Yeah, great examples. So Navdeep asked a question: how to determine the sample size for usability testing?
So for validation testing, FDA is very clear, 15 minimum per user group. So like I said, each user profile, if you have 3 different groups of users, lay users or surgical techs or nurses who are going to be using this product, you're going to need 45 participants at the minimum. In terms of formative testing, we generally shoot around 6 people minimum per user group, but it's not, a statistically significant sample size for formative testing. I believe for 15 is a statistically significant sample size for the FDA, but we're not looking at the rate of success based on each task during the actual validation test. If there is a lot of use error on during one task, or use issues for one task, then you do need to either change the design of the device, improve risk control measures like training or warning labels, materials, or there's other methodologies to control that risk as well.
All right.
One a little bit deeper there.
That's okay. Milton, this one I think is directly for you. This comes from Keith. Keith wants to know, how does ICS capture the pre-design controls process in the QMS?
So basically the pre-design controls process, so if that's the 62366 side, it's just basically following that process, and the outputs of that, end up being your documentation.
Okay. And maybe to build upon Keith's question, David asked, do you include the 62366 elements in your design history file? Given you completed them prior to design controls, how does an auditor respond to the work done prior to design controls?
So we try to keep it separate because, right, it's not formally under that. It does show up though in the submission, which is different than the DHF, but that's the footprint that we tried to use for it. Is we tie it just to the submission under the HFE UE report. Miles, I don't know if you have a different perspective. In terms of,
I do not.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so we got time for a few more questions. Really good questions, by the way. So Becky asked, do IVDs require human factors and/or usability testing?
It depends. So this also goes back to
that's the famous regulatory answer.
That's just the go-to, right? So
it's the go-to, yeah.
For example, like certain at-home tests that do diagnose a disease, or serologic tests that prove the presence of antibodies that are done at home that present undue use related risk to the user, do need to undergo usability testing. But if it's a serological test that's conducted in a clinic by a nurse who's trained on that sort of product, and it's pretty much standard practice using a Lancet and then putting it on the cassette. If you read the combination products guidance from CEDAR, they list certain types of products and user groups that are exempt from usability testing, if that answers your question, I think. So yep. Yeah, it depends on the user and the setting, essentially, for IVD.
Yep. All right, so Justin has a couple questions. I think they're more or less the same question, so I'll do my best to combine these, Justin. But the first part of this is UX required for product hardware defined for medical device versus the UX for an app. We'll pause there, and then I'll get to the second part of his question.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite register that. So
Yeah. Is UX required for product hardware versus UX for an app? Is it essentially the same process, or is it required for both scenarios?
well, it's required for the product, and if your product has, say, physical hardware, buttons on the outside, handles, that sort of thing. It certainly applies as part of your submission, and it's fair game for the approvers of your submission.
And then the second part of what Justin's asking is, what if their app is already developed? How do they get their app through the medical device requirements now that it is already built?
Oh, that sounds like a retrofit.
Yeah, well, it could be like a non-med device product that's now being, like maybe a general wellness device that's now has a medical device indication or something too. So yeah, there could be a couple of scenarios there.
Yeah, I don't think there's a pretty answer. It's more or less step through all the steps you would have gone through if you had developed this under design controls, from requirements, specifications, testing, etc.
Okay. All right, so we'll make this our last question since we're right at time, and I'm sure folks are excited to get to the pre-submission session here in a few moments. But Robin asked, thank you. This is a class 2 special controls and clinicals are not necessarily required. So if clinical studies, or let me back up. This is a class 2 device with special controls, and clinicals are not necessarily required. So if clinical studies under an IDE are not done, are there other best practices? So I think, to paraphrase this, I think what Robin is saying is that she has a class 2 device that does not require clinicals. Is there some other way to get human factor, actual human experience without going under an IDE for a clinical study?
Yeah, so I answered this her earlier question, I think, while Milton was talking, and or responded to it on here. And yeah, there are certain actual usability studies that you can do. Obviously, it's a lot cheaper and easier to combine that with a clinical study. This is for a patient-specific device that's 3D printed for the patient that she's talking about. So yeah, there's actual use studies that you can do. They're a lot harder to monitor, especially because you're going to be having the patients potentially be using this continuously, I assume. So there are, if you want to reach out later, I can actually fill you in on more of this because it's a little bit complicated, and there's a lot of considerations that go into this sort of actual use testing as opposed to simulated use.
All right. I kid. I have one question. I'm assuming it might be a little tongue-in-cheek, but Charbel asks, can Canadians be used as representative users in a summative evaluation?
If you live in the U.S., if you're a resident, like permanent resident,
okay,
yes. You don't have to be a citizen, just a resident.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you so much. So folks, let me help me give a round of applause or thumbs up. I know several comments. Push the button that says you like it. Whatever the scenario is here in this session, a lot of comments about people really loving this session. So thank you so much to Milton Yarberry with ICS and Miles Buroker with UserWise on their presentation on how user experience design and human factors engineering can accelerate product development. If you have questions that we didn't get to today, their contact information is on screen, and I'm sure they'd be more than happy to reach out to you. And as Milton mentioned a little bit earlier before we close this session down, in the handouts, there's slide decks and other details that are yours to consume. And I think ICS has an assessment document there that you can go through and reach out to them and see if they might be able to help too. So thank you, gentlemen.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Take care.
All right.
Thanks, guys.